25 Heavy, LA to runway 25 left, vector line number 2, following Camping Heavy, Airbus 3 mile farm.
Okay, number 2.
What's going on, guys? Flyby Simulations here, and welcome to the 6th episode in the full flight portion of this Aircrafts Dissected series, where we delve into every single switch, knob, and display in the flight deck of the Zibo mod Boeing 737-800. So, in the previous episode, we completed the engine start and pushback procedure, and in this one, the main highlights, as you can probably tell from the title and thumbnail of this video, are going to be the taxi and takeoff procedure. So, without further ado, let's jump into the flight deck and get started. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the flight deck of the Boeing 737-800, and as you can see, as usual, the buttons, knobs, and panel states have been set to the exact same position that they were in the previous episode. So, with the engine started, let's get into the before taxi procedure to get the aircraft ready for, well, you guessed it, taxi. So again, let's head over to the overhead panel and start flicking some switches as per the Ken Air checklist. So, first things first, we're going to start drawing electrical power from the engine generators. So simply come down to the bus transfer and electrical source selector panel and flick both the engine generators down to power either side of the flight deck, just like we did for the APU in the previous episodes of this series. As you can see, the APU bus light comes on automatically, signifying that we have the APU also available to use as our power source, but since we now have both the engines providing power, we no longer need the APU. Additionally, just like the APU startup procedure, we'll go up to the AC and DC power monitoring panel and switch the DC knob to TR1 to see if we're getting the right electrical indications from the first transformer rectifier unit, and we'll also switch this AC knob to the Gen 1 position to see if the electrical generators in the first engine are indeed providing ample power for normal aircraft operation. Again, if you don't know what a transformer rectifier unit is or what any of these panels and knobs are in general, I highly encourage you to watch the previous 11 episodes of the series. Alright, next up, we're going to go up to the external heating panel and turn on both the probe heat switches. Now, if you remember from episode 1, this system is responsible for providing power to the sensitive equipment on the outside of the aircraft, such as pitot tubes and guided alpha vanes. As you can see, turning them on gets rid of the amber lights on either side of the two switches, thereby signifying that the systems are working as intended. Coming further down, we don't want to make any changes to either the wing or engine anti-ice, as it's a nice warm day here in San Francisco without any signs of visible moisture around. Next up, coming to the right, we're going to go over to the air conditioning panel and turn the pack systems back to auto so they can resume air circulation within the cabin for passenger comfort. While we're here, let's also turn the isolation valve from the downmost on position now to the middle auto position. This will allow the pneumatic and air conditioning systems within the aircraft to automatically handle the passage of air and its circulation throughout various regions of the aircraft. Next up, we're going to turn off the APU because, as mentioned before, we no longer need it since the engines are providing both bleed air as well as acting as an electrical power source. So the first thing we're going to do is to restrict the bleed air being produced by the APU from entering the cabin. To do this, simply turn off the APU bleed air switch over here. As you can see, the dual bleed light up here automatically extinguishes, thereby signifying that there is now only one source of bleed air in the aircraft, namely the engines. Next up, come over to the main APU switch and turn it to the off position, which will completely turn off the APU. So the final action to perform on the forward overhead panel is to go ahead and turn the engine start switches to the continuous mode. As mentioned in previous episodes, this prevents the engines from accidentally turning off due to electrical surges or heavy precipitation as it arms the engine igniters continuously. And that's that for the forward overhead panel. So next up, we're going to come down here to the throttle quadrant and verify that both the main thrust levers are in their idle position, which means that they are pulled all the way to the back. Then, we verify that all the ground equipment connected to the aircraft is indeed clear, which we already did in the previous episode, so nothing to do there. Finally, on the throttle quadrant, we're also going to go ahead and set the flaps for takeoff. So if you remember from episode 9 of this series, our flap position for takeoff was going to be 5 degrees. So simply move this flap lever to this 5 detent. Now, I personally have the flaps mapped to a button on my throttle quadrant setup, so I don't have to use the mouse to drag and drop the flap lever. I suggest you guys do the same, as it can be very inconvenient to always have to focus on the actual flap lever to be able to manipulate it. As you can see from one of the right passenger windows, the flaps do indeed droop down to a lower position, thereby increasing the surface area of the wing and allowing the aircraft to fly at lower speeds. Alright, so once we're done with that, we'll go ahead and conduct the flight control check, which involves testing the full range of movement of all the physical, movable surfaces within the aircraft. So in order to do this, simply come over to this MFD panel and press this System button, which, as you can see, will provide a live representation of every movable surface within the aircraft on the lower display unit. So we'll go ahead and test all movements one by one, starting with the ailerons. So turn the stick full left, and as you can see, the appropriate ailerons and spoilers are moving as intended to be able to make a full left turn. Next, we'll go full right, again making sure that we have proper movement of all of the flight surfaces as intended. Neutral. Full up. Now make sure that the elevator is getting pushed up all the way, and full down. Finally, we're also going to test the rudder. So rudder full left, and rudder full right. There we go. The flight control check has been completed. Once this is done, we're going to make this lower display unit blank by again going up to this MFD and pressing the engine button twice. The first press switches the lower DU from the system page to the engine page, and the second press provides a condensed version of engine indications on the upper DU while making the lower DU blank. Now, the reason we like to keep the lower DU blank throughout the flight is because any problems, faults, or failures within the engines or flight control systems always appear on the lower display unit, and if the lower DU is blank, the entire screen will light up when there's a problem, as compared to only a part of it lighting up when the entire lower DU was left on. Essentially, having an entire screen come on has a much bigger chance of grabbing the pilot's attention as compared to a small indication appearing on an already complicated and lit up page. Hope that makes sense. Finally, the next item is something I missed in the before start procedure in the previous video, which is setting the trim for takeoff. Again, I have this button mapped to some buttons on my real physical joystick, but simply come down to this trim wheel and set the trim value stated on the takeoff page on the CDU. The value doesn't really need to be exact, just around the right value should be just fine. Alright, with that all done, let's come over to this light strip on the forward overhead panel and turn on the taxi light over here. Furthermore, if you're flying at night, I also recommend turning on these runway turn-off lights, as well as the logo and wing lights, but since we're flying during daytime, I'm going to keep those off for now. Finally, come back to the main forward panels and press this recall button to make sure that all the systems are working as intended. And that's that for the before taxi checklist. Alright, with that all done, let's begin taxiing to the runway. Now, if you guys want to know how I predicted my path to the runway and what our plan for the departure procedure is going to be for today's flight, make sure to watch the previous video, as that has all the information regarding the taxi and takeoff procedure. That being said, I will try to put a little live schematic of our entire taxi route on screen for you guys to be able to follow along the route as we go from taxiway to taxiway and eventually get to runway 28 right for departure. So let's go down here and release the parking brake. Next up, advance the thrust levers a tad bit, maybe to around 27 to 30% N1, just to provide the aircraft with a little bit of an initial kick so that it begins to roll on the tarmac. As you can see, the aircraft has started to move. Now, the specific indication that I would like you guys to keep an eye on is this GS, or ground speed indication, on the top left of this ND. This is your exact taxi speed, and you want to keep it below 30 knots at all times when taxiing. However, note that you can only travel on the ground at 30 knots when you're on a straight stretch. During turns, for example, you must restrict the speed to below 15 knots, and for tighter turns, try and restrict the speed to below 10 knots just to be safe. As you can see, we have taken a right here, as mentioned in the previous episode, and will soon be transitioning from this Alpha taxiway we're on right now to the Foxtrot taxiway. Again, try not to keep advancing and retracting the thrust levers during taxi. Try and find a thrust setting that provides constant momentum while not going too fast or too slow. The more you taxi, the more you learn, so feel free to play around the thrust setting as you please. Okay, so as you can see on the taxi chart, we have now transitioned onto the Foxtrot taxiway from Alpha, and I would like to bring your attention to this blinking line on the taxiway right here. This is a runway threshold, and signifies to the pilots that there is a runway in front of the blinking perimeter. As you can see on the airport charts, this is indeed true, as we have runway 01 left and 01 right that we need to cross to continue our route to get to our departure runway. So in real life, pilots would normally be instructed to stop their taxi and hold short of this runway threshold and contact ATC before crossing the runways. The ground controller would then either allow the aircraft to cross the runway based on other traffic on the ground, or would instruct them to continue holding short until it is absolutely safe for the aircraft to continue taxiing. In our case, let's just assume that ATC has cleared to resume taxi. So, abiding by procedure, the pilots would check both sides of the runway visually and confirm that there is no departing or arriving traffic. They will then turn the position light to the strobe and steady position, which will activate the blinking lights at the tip of each wing, thereby making the aircraft stand out even more when taxiing across the runway. After these precautionary measures have been taken, simply resume the taxi. So disconnect the brakes, apply thrust, and cross the runways as required. So, once we've crossed the runways, we just have a straight taxi along Foxtrot to runway 28 left. Additionally, at this point, we'll go ahead and turn the position lights back to the steady position, and we'll restart it when we're getting onto our departure runway. As we taxi, another tip I'd like to give you guys to keep the aircraft's nose wheel bang on in the middle of the taxi line is to keep this fire warning light flush with the taxiway in the main cockpit view. As you can see, that puts the aircraft bang on in the center of the taxiway. As we approach runway 28 left, normally we would stop at the runway threshold and again get permission from ATC to cross the runway. However, in the interest of time, we'll just assume that runway 28 left is not in operation right now and we'll cross it and stop at the runway threshold for 28 right instead, which happens to be our departure runway. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we are now stopped at the runway threshold for runway 28 right. So let's run through the takeoff procedure on the Ken Air checklist. Now note that most of these actions, such as turning on the lights or the weather radar, are all performed as the aircraft smoothly gets onto the runway by both the captain and the first officer on a normal flight. However, for the instructional purposes of this video, we'll stay behind the runway threshold and perform all of these items first before getting onto the runway. So first things first, let's go up to the forward overhead panel and alert the cabin crew to let them know we're about to take off. You can do this by pressing this attend button right next to the passenger sign switches, which obviously sounds a little chime. Next up, on the captain's EFIS panel, we're going to turn on the weather radar, so as to see weather returns and rain cells in the distance. On the first officer's side, we'll go ahead and turn on the terrain mode, so we can see our nearby terrain as we take off on the ND. Next up, I also like to click on this data button on both sides to be able to get accurate altitude and speed constraint information on the ND. With that all done, we then come to the actual takeoff procedure, where the first item on our list is to turn the position lights to the strobe and steady position, like we did when crossing those two runways earlier on during the taxi. Next up, we're going to come down to this central pedestal and turn on this transponder. So go over to this knob and turn the TCAS system to TARA, which stands for Traffic Advisory and Resolution Advisory, as explained in detail in episode 2 of this series. Finally, go ahead and turn on all of the runway lights up top. Now this can be done easily by pressing this little shutter on top, which allows you to push all of the lights down at the same time. At this time, also turn off the taxi light, as we now have the main landing lights illuminating the front of the aircraft. Finally, we're also going to go ahead and start the captain's clock here to log our actual air time. Now with that all done, let's line up and wait on the runway, so disconnect the parking brake and get onto the runway. Alright, so before we begin the takeoff sequence, let me give you guys a brief summary of what's about to happen, as things happen very fast when we start picking up speed. My plan, therefore, is to give a brief summary of the indications I'd like you to pay attention to, and I'll then actually live commentate the takeoff sequence. So at the beginning of the takeoff sequence, we're going to advance the thrust levers to 40% to N1. The reason we do this is to make sure that we're getting symmetrical thrust from both engines. After a second or two, once we establish that the thrust is being provided uniformly by both engines, we will push the toga button. Now the Zibo mod actually has a secret button right in front of the pilots that you can push to activate this toga switch, and it is this mic button right here. So once pressed, we're going to notice that our thrust jumps up to our N1 bugs that have been set up on the upper display unit. You'll notice that we will begin moving on the runway and start picking up speed. As we continue down the runway, our airspeed monitor will come alive and we will start reading the appropriate speed indications on the speed tape here on the PFD. I will call out the speed at 80 knots, then at 100 knots, just as an added reference. As we get close to V1, we will expect our virtual first officer in the flight to call V1, and we will go ahead and pull the nose of the aircraft gently back as we reach our V rotate speed of 143 knots. We will keep increasing our angle of attack and pitch up to 15 degrees on the artificial horizon. Right after takeoff, I will also give a call out when we have a positive rate of climb, meaning that the aircraft is properly climbing without loss of thrust or power. At this point, I will enunciate gear up, and we will retract the landing gear of the aircraft. We will then hand fly the departure till about 1,000 to 1,500 feet, following which we will go ahead and engage the autopilot. Now normally I enjoy flying the departure a little bit longer before handing controls to autopilot, but for the instructional purposes of this video, I would like to decrease my workload early on to be able to explain various procedures to you guys, such as flap retraction and such. So if it sounds all complicated, just wait for the live commentary portion where everything will be explained as perfectly as can be. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the live commentary portion of this Aircrafts Dissected episode. And as mentioned before, I'll be trying to walk you guys through this takeoff procedure as best as I can, but things do happen very fast. So I would like you guys to pay attention to the things I just mentioned in terms of the N1 rising, as well as keeping an eye on the primary flight display and the flight directors that will pop up and stuff like that. I'll try to refer to as many things as possible, but it might get fast. So I'd like you guys to rewind the video and watch the previous part of this video where I explain everything that's just happened if you haven't done so already. Anyways, so what we're going to do, first things first, we're going to come down to the parking brake and release it. And then we're just going to simply advance the thrust levers to 40% on the N1, as you can see. And confirming we have symmetrical thrust, advance the thrust levers all the way and hit the toga button. Now, don't look at your instruments just yet. You want to just simply look in front of you. Always have a visual reference on the runway. That is always a priority. Use the rudder on the ground as well as the nose wheel tiller if you have that mapped. We have the airspeed alive, 80 knots. And we have 100 knots. Now we're just going to wait for our virtual first officer to call V1. Simply keep the aircraft in the center line of the runway. V1, rotate. So when rotating the aircraft, rotate gently, no need to yank the stick back all the way, and simply follow the flight directors, which are the pink crossers that we have. Positive rate of climb, gear up. And we have retracted the landing gear of the aircraft. Now simply just keep following the flight directors on the primary flight display. As we can see, the flight directors are having us be at a pitch of around 15 degrees. We just want to simply follow that. And we're starting to pitch down a little bit so as to allow the aircraft to gain some speed. And as we get to around 1,500 feet, we'll engage the autopilot. So we're getting to our 1,500 feet, the engines are spooling down. And there we go, we can come here and engage the autopilot. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we have successfully taken off in a Boeing 737-800. So, take it in, all the last 11 episodes have just been leading up to this moment. In the next episode, we'll be taking a look at the climb and cruise portion of our full flight from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Just like the previous episode, I'll be keeping this conclusion short as I want the transition from this episode to the next to be as seamless as possible. So if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to perform a full stop landing at the like button and the subscribe button and press the bell icon for future notifications from this channel. Also, be sure to fly by the comments section and let me know if there's any questions you'd like me to answer for you. As usual, thanks for flying by.